There are so many colors of paints recommended by so many different artists, it can give you phobia just to choose your own colors for your palette. But today, I want to give you less choices. Hi, this is Eric from Cafe Watercolor. When I was in my first painting class in art school, we started off using two colors, black and white. It was an oil painting class, so we used white. After that, we used three colors, orange, blue, and white. This is to give us the basic understanding of warm and cool with different values. And then we painted a limited palette, which is what I want to show you today. Now, everyone has a different limited palette set. I'm going to share with you mine, but here are three reasons why you want to practice with a limited palette. Number one, color mixing efficiency. You might already know how to mix color and have some understanding of color theory, but the key word here is efficiency. If you only have a few colors to work with, you are less likely to be confused about what color you should use. Think of it as cooking. If you start cooking with 10 different spices, you might get a little bit confused, and it's very easy to get into the pressure to use them all because you don't want any of them to go wasted. Same thing as color mixing. Without a solid understanding of each color, you are just making your color mixing more complicated and confusing, and that's not going to be efficient. Efficiency in color mixing is way more important in watercolor than almost every other medium because we are constantly working with the drying time. If you spend too much time figuring out what color you should use to mix a specific color, you are risking the consistency of wash. So having a few colors forces you to be efficient with your color mixing. Number two, establish your color mixing foundation. When you start with just a few essential colors, you are establishing your color mixing foundation. You will learn how to mix your warm and cool colors, and you also learn how to mix different values of them. And once you master these colors and their capabilities, you can then expand your palette to fit your own need. Like the name suggested, a limited palette is limited. So there might be some colors you want to use that you won't be able to get from the limited palette. But now you know exactly what you want, instead of just getting 20 colors with half of them you don't even know what they're for. Number three, train your value mixing. In most cases, value is more important than colors, especially if you want to paint something believable. Everyone talks about colors, but colors are only visible when there is light. And the best way to interpret lighting in your painting? Value. Having a limited palette to work with will help you focus more on mixing different values. Once you're able to focus on the value, all the colors will just be there to support it. Like I said, if you have too many colors, you might feel the pressure to use them all, and that takes your attention and energy away from mixing the right value for your painting. Okay, now I'm going to share with you my limited palette and do a painting with it. Before we start, if you like my content, be sure to give a like and subscribe. Hit the bell icon so you won't miss my next video. Okay, let's do some painting. Okay, so let's look at the four colors that I use for this limited palette. Now I got this cheap disposable palette just for this demo, so it'll be easier for you to see. So this is really just three colors with a black. So I have cobalt blue, yellow ochre, and burnt sienna. So the color black is neutral tint. Now we all know the primary colors are yellow, blue, and red. With the three primary colors, you can mix with a huge variety of colors. But if we just use primary color, it could be a little bit hard to control because they are very saturated. So my limited palette is basically the muted version of the primaries, except the blue. The cobalt blue is basically a very typical blue we have. But the yellow, we use yellow ochre instead of something like cadmium yellow, and we use burnt umber instead of a cadmium red, and so on. And the neutral tint is really just there for me to easily darken the color, but I actually don't really use it all that much in this demo. So I am painting the color out on this paper. So as you can see, cobalt blue obviously is blue, but yellow ochre is this toned down muted yellow and burnt sienna, you got this dirt looking red, almost like a rusty red. Now I'm not going to talk too much about color theory, but if you mix blue and yellow, you get green, so that's what we're getting right now. The difference is, since yellow ochre is more of a earth tone yellow, so we get a earth tone green. So now I'm adding more yellow ochre to the mix. So now we're getting a warmer green. So very simply, if I add more blue to the mixture, I get a cooler green. So just by mixing two colors, you shift the balance, you get a different type of green. Mixing yellow and red, you get orange. So in our case, mixing yellow ochre and burnt sienna, we get a muted orange. Now this is not some bright neon orange, this is a very down-to-earth earth tone orange, so it's almost look like a dirt color. Now if we mix all three colors together, we get a neutral gray because they cancel each other out. And now by adding more blue, I get a cooler gray. If I add either yellow ochre or burnt sienna, then I get a warmer gray. Now I haven't touched any neutral tint because that's just a black color, that's just going to darken the color. So just play with these three colors, see what you can come up with. This is just a very quick introduction of this limited palette. These are all very typical colors that most artists, and maybe you probably have those colors too. So play around with them, see how much you can get out of it, and push the limit of this limited palette. Okay, so I'm going to do two paintings with limited palette, one portrait and one scenery. Let's start with scenery because it's easier. I'll start with the drawing. So this is a photo I taken from a park about 15 minutes away. The interesting thing about this park is that it actually has a farm in it. So there's a red barn with a bunch of animal in it, like horse, and there's a pig, goat, and some chickens, and so on. So I took this photo in a sunny day. The color is very nice, the lighting is very nice, and it's simple enough for our limited palette painting. So I'm wetting the paper. Sort of randomly, I leave a little bit of the dry area for the sky, for the cloud area. But now that the paper is wet, I am painting the red barn with burnt sienna, that is our red here, and start painting cobalt blue for the sky color. I leave some white for the cloud, add a little bit shadow on the cloud with a little bit of neutral tint. Then I mix a green color with cobalt blue and yellow ochre and start to put in the green, mostly while it is still wet. For the roof color, I mix our muted purple, which is cobalt blue plus burnt sienna. That gives us a nice neutral, kind of purple-ish looking color. So again, the first wash is the color of the light, so I paint it all wet onto wet. So I just let it bloom, and I can come back later and start to define things a little bit more. Now let's move on to our portrait painting. I am right-handed, that's why I work on the left side of the paper first. If I work on the right side of the paper first, it's going to be very difficult not to have my hand touch the wet paper. So anyways, I start with the drawing. Now this is just an exercise, so it's very small, so I'm not planning to do a very detailed portrait. Something very loose, but still try to keep the structure of the face there. This beautiful girl is Anastasia. She is somebody I knew through Instagram. The reason I choose this photo again is because the color is very simple and the lighting is also very simple. I don't need to paint in a lot of shadow and dark. So this is not a portrait demo, so I'm just going to speed through the drawing very quickly, but basically try to match the proportion and the perspective and angle of the face. The drawing for the portrait takes a lot longer than the barn, even though I'm not striving for the very close likeness, but at least it needs to look like a person. So the proportion and the structure still need to be somewhat accurate. Finishing up the face, and I just indicate the hair in, drawing the ear, the neck, I'm just erasing some of the initial constructing lines, so just to keep the line work a little bit cleaner. So when I start painting it, there won't be too much graphite smearing around. Okay, after that, first thing I'm going to do is to clean the palette. This palette is actually a pain to use because it's so small, but for a too small painting, this should do. So since I don't have any saturated color like cadmium red and cadmium orange, my usual portrait palette, I'm just going to use burnt sienna as red and yellow ochre to keep things a little bit more towards the orange side. The important thing here is to keep the wash transparent, especially the skin tone. I did a video before about skin tone. If you haven't watched that one, go check that one out. There's a lot of good tips that I'm sharing. So the first wash, again, color of the light. I'm just keeping it very transparent. Now move back to our barn painting. The first wash is dry, so it's time for us to paint the second wash. So the second wash, I'm going to start painting the tree. Now mixing the green with yellow ochre and cobalt blue because I have no other choice. That's the only two color that makes green. But I just make it a little bit thicker and a little bit more opaque. Now if I want a little bit more variety, I shift the balance between the warm and cool. So by adding a little bit more blue, I get a bluer, cooler green. If I want warmer green, I add some more yellow ochre. So just this two color, you can actually mix a variety of green. Now painting the roof again, we need to darken that a little bit. Now I'm not afraid to connect the shape with the tree. Just make sure the color is a little bit cooler and a little bit more towards the purple side. So cobalt blue and burnt sienna. So as you can see, by just using three colors, we limit ourselves. But at the same time, it is so much easier for us to mix the color. And because they're mostly earth tone and they're muted color, the color come out of the mixture are mostly very stable. Nothing jumps out too much. Everything looks harmonious. So I'm painting the shadow on the barn, which is mostly burnt sienna, but I also add a little bit of blue just to make it a little bit darker. So it's still mostly red, but a darker shade of red. And also painting the shadow on the grass. Now the grass is of course not going to be as vibrant as the photo because we don't have a very saturated yellow. However, you can still read it as grass. Adding the shadow to the side of the barn and go up, connect to the dark of the tree. Again, it's all about connection. Connect all the dark shape together. So it is value that makes this painting, not just the color. The colors are very simple, but the variety of value and warm and cool make this painting looks like it's a full color painting. But in fact, we are only using three colors. And I haven't even really used neutral tint that much because we don't need anything that dark just yet. So connect the shadow shape to the dark side of the tree, and our painting is taking shape already. Granted, this is a very simple subject, but sometimes very simple subject can be very effective and also powerful as well. I'm adding the roof to the side. I keep the White House white, of course. Just wrapping up this wash, giving a little bit of the tone on the ground there. Now let's move back to our portrait. This is quite fun because I approach scenery and portrait quite differently, but with the same color, so this is actually very fun. And with portrait, it's a lot more delicate. I need to work little by little. So I start off by painting the upper eyelid, connect that to the iris, the corner of the eye. And before it is dry, I start to connect the eyelid shape to the shadow of the eye socket all the way to the brow, basically modeling the structure of the eye out. Remember to soften some hard edges where you don't want them with a damp, almost dry brush. The lower eyelid, get a little bit of form in there. And I keep my mixture mostly pretty moist. One of the things about mixing skin tone and painting portrait is to keep your wash mostly pretty transparent. You don't want to go very opaque, very dark very soon. Especially painting a young lady like her, you don't want to emphasize on the shadow too much. And contrast is relative as well. We have a very bright skin here, so if I mix the shadow too dark, it's going to be too much contrast. Just a little bit of, actually just mid-tone, you can already see quite a bit of contrast already. The bottom of the nose, I use mostly just burnt sienna. I really need to have that nose a little bit warmer so that it projects out. Bring the shadow down a little bit and soften the bottom so it's a very soft shadow. And now I am painting the lip. The upper lip is in the shadow, so it's a little bit darker, so the mixture is a lot more opaque. But I also bring a little bit of that wash down for the bottom lip. And I'm also giving her chin some shadow. Her face is in the light, so it's casting a shadow on her neck. So while I'm at it, I'm also painting her hair, and just to get a little bit of dark value there so that her face pops out, just to push the overall value range a little bit more. Now her hair, I start to use a little bit more blue, mostly because I want a little bit of contrast between her hair and her face. So I treat her hair as a group as well, so I paint some shape and leave out some white, but I'm not worrying about each single hair string. That's not what this painting is about. Treat the hair as a shape, focus on the value, and play around with warm and cool a little bit. I'm actually having quite a bit of fun painting this. These are just some small exercise, but sometimes little exercise like these is fun to do, and you don't have the pressure to have a very nice, refined, finished piece. And usually the result can be surprisingly good. Okay, let's move back to our barn. We are almost finished with this one. Now I'm using the neutral tint because I want some really dark detail in the barn, such as the window. That's pretty much a really dark spot that we need. So once we put that in, we got a full value range from light to dark. And I also just use a smaller brush and get a little bit of detail in. So the edge of the window frame, the occluded shadow under the roof, and things like that. Those are little details that's really going to push this painting to make it look more refined and finished. Now I want the barn to be a little bit more vibrant, so I just do a glazing on top with burnt sienna. So even though this is not going to be as bright as using something like a cadmium red, it still get a very nice vibrancy there. And especially if you have a nice value and sense of lighting, it's going to make the painting look brighter and more vibrant than it really is. So even though the color that we use, they are mostly muted, but because the sense of the lighting in this painting, that makes the color actually feels a little bit more vibrant and more saturated. So this is why I said value is actually more important than the color itself. Just adding a little bit more detail, some wooden post, a little bit of texture on the roof, adding a little bit dark in the tree. And I call this one finished. And now let's move back to the portrait again. So the portrait is mostly done as well. All we need is a little bit more dark just to complete the value range. So I add a little bit more detail in the nostril, but not to make them too dark. Just a little bit more warmth to it. And starting to add more dark to her eyes, her iris, the upper eyelid, and eyebrow as well. Adding dark is to help the structure to look a little bit more pops and dimensional. It's very important that you don't start to outline the feature and the shape. Anything you do in the portrait, it should be helping to enhance the structure, to make it look more dimensional on the 2D surface. This is especially important when we're painting portrait. There's a little bit too much contrast in her eye, even though there's white of the eye and the iris. But if you kind of squint your eyes, they're all kind of blend into a single value. So I'm trying to unify them a little bit by adding a little bit of glaze on top. Also adding some very dark shadow in between her lips. Adding a little bit of shadow under her lower lip. Darken the cast shadow on her neck. This one makes her face pops out a little bit more. So looking at the photo, the shadow near her face is a little bit warmer, and when it goes down, it gets a little bit cooler. So I add more blue on the bottom. Now to give her shirt just a little bit of definition, I paint some shape, and I soften the bottom edge with some water. She's wearing an earring, so I just add some dark to it. I'm making her lip a little bit thicker, so it matches the source a little bit better. Now again, I'm not trying to strive for exact likeness. I'm not good with that anyways. So I'm just using the photo as a reference. And hopefully with limited palette, I can come out with a painting that looks decent. I'm using a bigger brush to paint the hair. Bring that out into the background. Try to add a little bit of transition between the hair and the face. Soften some of the shape, and we are done with the portrait as well. Let's remove the tape and look at the painting side by side. This is such a fun exercise. I really encourage you to try it, especially if you're struggling with color mixing. This is going to help you tremendously by limiting your option. You can practice mixing the essential colors of warm and cool, and also different value. Hope that was helpful. This is actually very similar to value studies, but taking warm and cool into the mix. After you're familiar with the limited palette you have, you will be able to expand your palette to fit your need instead of simply trying to use what other artists are using. If you like this video, consider subscribing, ring the bell icon so you won't be missing my next video and my live stream painting. You can also go to my website at cafewatercolor.com to download my free watercolor PDF guide. I have more video in this channel, go check them out. I'm Eric from Cafe Watercolor. I will see you again soon.